The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the small town of Belmont. It was the kind of evening that felt like it was holding its breath, suspended between the heat of the day and the coolness of the approaching night. Officer Daniel Hayes leaned against his patrol car, taking a slow drag from a cigarette as he surveyed the streets. The scent of asphalt mixed with the heavy, humid air. He had been on this beat for over 5 years, but every evening felt the same. A monotonous rhythm, a routine he had long stopped questioning. Belmont wasn't a big town, and the job wasn't difficult, but it had its moments. There was always something about the quiet that unnerved him, as though it was just a facade covering up something more complicated underneath. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing against the pavement. He looked up and saw a figure approaching. A tall man in his mid-20s, walking at a steady pace, with his hands loosely in his pockets. His dark skin contrasted sharply against the fading light of the evening. He wore a loose-fitting gray t-shirt and jeans that hung a little too low on his frame. The man was walking alone, his gaze shifting from side to side as though constantly aware of the world around him. There was a tension in his posture, as if he was trying to remain inconspicuous. But that only made Daniel more curious. "Hey!" Officer Hayes called, pushing himself off the car. His voice was loud enough to be commanding but not aggressive. The man stopped in his tracks, turning toward him. "What's up?" the man asked, his voice calm, though there was a slight edge to it. Hayes could feel the subtle change in the air. He wasn't sure why, but something about the man's presence was making him uneasy. Maybe it was the way he was walking, too slow, too deliberate. Or maybe it was just the feeling he had, one that had been creeping up on him for weeks. The restlessness in the air seemed to be everywhere now, in the way people looked at him and each other. "You live around here?" Hayes asked, stepping forward slightly, his hand brushing the holster at his side. He wasn't making any move to draw his weapon, but the gesture was enough to communicate authority. The man hesitated for a second before answering. "Yeah, I'm staying with my cousin." He paused and then added, "Tony Harris." Hayes narrowed his eyes. Tony Harris was a name he knew, not because Tony had ever been in trouble, but because he had lived in Belmont for years. His family was well respected in the community, even if some people still eyed them suspiciously. A few bad rumors had spread over the years, but nothing concrete. Still, Hayes had heard enough to make him wary. "Where's Tony?" Hayes asked, his tone a little sharper now. The man, Jamal as it turned out, shifted on his feet. "He's working tonight. I'm just heading to the store. It's nothing serious." "Uh-huh," Hayes muttered, studying him. Something still didn't feel right. He scanned Jamal's face, trying to read the man's eyes. Jamal didn't look like he was hiding anything, but Hayes had learned to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that this situation needed to be handled carefully. "I need to see some ID," Hayes said abruptly. Jamal's eyebrows furrowed. "I don't have it on me. I wasn't expecting to be stopped." "Not carrying ID?" Hayes's voice took on a condescending edge. "That's unusual. You're walking around a town you don't live in, and you don't even have any identification." His eyes narrowed. "Where are you coming from?" "I'm just going to the store," Jamal said again, his voice a little firmer now. "That's it." Hayes didn't seem to hear him. He stepped closer, taking a few deliberate strides toward Jamal. "You mind if I search you?" The words hung in the air for a moment. Jamal's body tensed, his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on him. Too intense, too heavy. It was a feeling he knew all too well. The sick, gnawing suspicion that he was being judged before he even had a chance to explain himself. "Sir," Jamal began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I'm not doing anything wrong." Hayes didn't respond right away. He studied Jamal for a few more seconds before finally speaking. "Turn around." Jamal didn't move immediately. The words hung in the air between them like a silent challenge. It wasn't just the officer's request. It was the way it was said, as though Jamal was already guilty. "I'm just going to the store," Jamal repeated, but his voice faltered this time. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation, but there was something in the officer's eyes, something that made his gut twist with dread. Without warning, Hayes stepped forward, his hand grabbing Jamal's arm and twisting it behind his back. Jamal's heart pounded as the officer forced him to the ground, pushing his face against the rough concrete of the sidewalk. "Hey!" Jamal shouted, his voice a mix of frustration and fear. "What are you doing? I haven't done anything." "You'll be quiet," Hayes muttered under his breath, pressing harder on Jamal's back. "You're being detained until I figure this out." Jamal's breathing quickened, panic flooding his veins. He could feel the officer's weight on him, pressing down hard, but it wasn't the physical pain that stung the most. It was the humiliation, the suffocating feeling that came with being treated like an animal. He had been here before, in other towns, in other places, but it was always the same. The moment a black man crossed paths with a police officer, suspicion was immediately assumed. It didn't matter what he said, what he did. He was already guilty. "Don't resist," Hayes warned, his voice cold and steady. "Just be quiet." But Jamal wasn't going to be quiet. He knew that if he didn't say something, if he didn't make a stand, this would escalate further. His breath came out in sharp bursts as he struggled against the officer's hold. "Get off me," Jamal shouted, now completely on edge. His heart raced, his palms sweaty. Just then, a voice broke through the tension. "What the hell is going on?" Carla, Jamal's cousin, stood on the porch of her house, her phone already in hand. She had been watching from her window, waiting for Jamal to return, and when she saw him being pinned to the ground by Officer Hayes, her blood ran cold. "Officer, what's going on?" Carla shouted, taking a few steps forward, her voice growing louder. "What are you doing to my cousin?" Hayes stood up, releasing Jamal with one last, forceful push. He turned to Carla, his face hard, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps frustration, in his eyes. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. He's acting suspicious." Carla wasn't convinced. She had known Jamal for years, and she knew this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. Suspicious? He's just walking to the store. What is this? Another one of your suspicious black men you want to stop? Hayes's jaw clenched at the accusation, but he couldn't come up with an answer. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes darting nervously around the street. "I'll let you go this time," Hayes muttered, "but you better keep it together next time." He turned quickly, his boots echoing as he walked back to his car. Jamal slowly got to his feet, rubbing his wrists where the officer had grabbed him. He didn't say anything at first, too stunned to speak. He could hear Carla's angry voice in the distance, calling someone. Maybe her lawyer, maybe someone who could make this right. "You all right?" Carla asked softly, walking up to him, her concern evident in her eyes. Jamal nodded, though it was hard to swallow the lump in his throat. "Yeah, I just don't get it, Carla. I don't get why he had to do that." Carla didn't have an answer. She just pulled him into a hug, trying to offer comfort, but the weight of the moment hung heavy on them both. Weeks later, Daniel Hayes sat at his desk in the police station, staring at a pile of paperwork. His uniform felt too tight, his collar too stiff. There was no relief from the pressure. Complaints had been filed about his treatment of Jamal, and the investigation was going nowhere fast. Hayes had become the target of local outrage, not just from the community but from his own colleagues. His superiors had been distant, and it was clear that he was being watched. He had hoped that things would blow over, that the heat of the moment would dissipate, but it hadn't. The weight of his decision, the misjudgment that had led to Jamal's arrest, lingered like a shadow that he couldn't outrun. And now, he found himself questioning everything. The way he had treated Jamal, the way he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. The department had been too quiet, too indifferent to the whole situation. Hayes wasn't sure what was worse, the knowledge that he had wronged Jamal or the fact that no one seemed to care that he had. He sat there, alone in the sterile office, surrounded by the cold hum of fluorescent lights. And in that silence, he realized something. He had lost himself in this job, in the idea of what it meant to be a cop, a protector of the law. But he wasn't protecting anyone that day. Not Jamal. Not the people he swore to serve. And now, as the investigation closed in, the consequences of that day were catching up with him. His career was over, and the shadow of regret would be with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't the law he had broken, it was the trust. It had been a week since the incident on Main Street, and Jamal was struggling to shake off the lingering sense of unease that had settled over him. Every time he stepped out of the house, he felt as though he were walking under the gaze of invisible eyes, judging him, scrutinizing him. The town of Belmont hadn't felt so small before, but now, it seemed suffocating. The streets that used to feel familiar now seemed alien, as though everyone around him was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The world had become a stage, and he was the reluctant actor in a play he didn't want to star in. The day after the incident, Jamal had called his lawyer, and they had filed an official complaint against Officer Hayes. Carla had insisted on it, knowing that this wasn't something they could just ignore. She told him that they had to stand up for what was right, that people needed to know that this kind of treatment wasn't acceptable. Jamal had agreed, but it wasn't easy. He wasn't one for confrontation. And yet, as the days went on, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The officer's grip on his neck, the way he'd been thrown to the ground as though he were nothing more than a criminal, a danger simply because of the color of his skin. That evening, after another long day of trying to push through the discomfort, Jamal found himself standing outside his cousin's house. The weather was still heavy with the summer heat, the air thick with humidity. He hadn't planned on going anywhere, but the tension in the house was unbearable. Carla had been watching the news all afternoon, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Jamal could feel it in the air, the unspoken frustration, the sense that things were far from over. Carla was inside, pacing the living room, her phone glued to her ear. Jamal stood outside, leaning against the railing of the porch, trying to clear his mind. The street was quiet for the most part, save for the occasional car driving by. As he looked down the empty road, he heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. They were always there, always looming. As Jamal stared at the horizon, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. "Are you free to talk? This is Officer Hayes." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to ignore it. After all, Hayes was the last person he wanted to hear from. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that he couldn't just leave things hanging. He stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. "What do you want?" Took a minute before the phone buzzed again. "I owe you an apology. Can we meet? I'd like to explain." Jamal frowned. He had no idea what to make of it. An apology? From the same officer who had thrown him to the ground just a few days ago? He didn't know what to expect. But something in the message gave him pause. The thought of meeting with Hayes stirred a mix of emotions. Anger, confusion, but also something he couldn't quite name. He stepped inside and found Carla sitting on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, her face tight with frustration. When she saw Jamal standing in the doorway, she raised an eyebrow. "Who was it?" she asked, not needing to clarify. "Hayes," Jamal said, his voice quiet. "He wants to meet. Says he owes me an apology." Carla's expression hardened. "An apology? For what? For treating you like a criminal? For throwing you on the ground and not even listening to you? I don't know, Jamal replied, shaking his head. But he wants to explain. I don't know if I should hear him out or just tell him to get lost. Carla stood up, walking over to him. Jamal, this is your call. But don't go easy on him. He has a lot to answer for. We're not letting him off the hook. Jamal nodded, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He didn't want to meet Hayes, but part of him knew it might be the only way to make sense of the mess they were in. And maybe, just maybe, it could give him a sense of closure. I'll go, Jamal said after a pause, but I'm not doing this alone. Carla gave him a long look, then sighed. Fine, I'll go with you, but you know I'll be watching him like a hawk. They both got into Carla's car, and the drive was quiet, the only sound the hum of the tires against the road. Jamal's mind was racing, unsure of what to expect, unsure of what he even wanted from this meeting. When they arrived at the small cafe on the edge of town where Hayes had suggested they meet, Jamal felt a sudden surge of hesitation. He didn't want to show weakness, but this whole thing felt wrong from the start. As they walked inside, the bell above the door jingled. The place was nearly empty, save for a few regulars sipping their coffee in the corner. Officer Hayes was sitting at a table in the back, his uniform still crisp, but his demeanor was different. He looked older, somehow tired. His shoulders slumped in a way Jamal had never seen before. Hayes stood up when he saw them, his expression unreadable. Jamal noticed the way his eyes seemed to flicker with something. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Hayes cleared his throat. Thanks for meeting me, he said quietly. I didn't know what else to do. Jamal and Carla sat down across from him, their eyes locked on the officer. Carla's gaze was cold, but Jamal's was more guarded. I didn't ask for this, Jamal said flatly. I didn't ask to be thrown to the ground and treated like a criminal. You don't just get to come in here and apologize and expect everything to be okay. Hayes winced at the words, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he lowered his gaze, as though gathering his thoughts. You're right, Hayes said finally. I messed up. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I shouldn't have done that. I don't know why I acted that way. It's not an excuse, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know I was wrong. There was a long silence. Jamal's heart was still racing, his mind still processing Hayes's words. He didn't know if he should be relieved that the officer was admitting fault, or if he should be angry that it had taken this long for him to do so. I've been on this job for a long time, Hayes continued, his voice quieter now, and I've seen a lot of things. I've seen the anger, the fear, the way people look at each other. And sometimes it gets to you. It gets to your head. I let that happen with you. I looked at you, and all I saw was someone I couldn't trust. And that's on me. Jamal looked at Hayes, his expression unreadable. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. But this wasn't it. This wasn't the confrontation he had imagined in his mind. He wanted answers, he wanted justice. But in this moment, he was finding it hard to know what to say. So what now? Carla asked, breaking the silence. You just want him to forgive you and walk away? Hayes shook his head. No, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am asking for a chance to do better. To make things right. Jamal sat back in his chair, still processing everything. It felt surreal, hearing the officer speak so candidly, as though the wall of authority between them had suddenly crumbled. He didn't know if he could forgive him. He didn't know if he ever would. But for the first time in days, Jamal felt like he had a choice. I don't know if I can forgive you, Jamal said finally, but I appreciate you being honest. Hayes nodded, a faint trace of relief crossing his face. He had nothing more to say, and the conversation felt like it was over. But Jamal knew that this wasn't the end. It wasn't just about an apology, it was about something deeper, something that wasn't going to be solved in one conversation. As they stood to leave, Jamal glanced at Hayes one last time. There was something in the officer's eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe a realization that, in some ways, both of them had been trapped by the weight of their worlds.